Hi, this is Mike with Sand Peak Realty, and we're going to spend some time over the next few weeks on a lecture series on contracts. We're going to discuss several of the contracts that we use on a daily basis, including the exclusive right of sale listing agreement. We're going to explain the addendums and disclosures from the seller's perspective. We'll also spend some time on the as-is and FAR/BAR contract from the buyer's perspective. Then we'll look at the as-is and the FAR/BAR contract from the seller's perspective. And finally, we'll wind up the series on all of the disclosures and addendums necessary for your buyer. So sit back, relax, and let's get started. Today we're going to go over the exclusive right of sale listing agreement, one of the most important documents that a listing agent will use, as it defines the agreement between the seller and the brokerage and what will take place throughout the entire listing process. So we're going to start off with an overview. We're going to explain what the listing agreement encompasses, explain what it does for the brokerage, the agent, and the seller. We're also going to explain what it includes. We'll go through all 14 sections for a thorough understanding. And then finally, we're going to wind up with 10 things to discuss with the seller at the listing appointment. So what is the listing agreement? First of all, it is a marketing agreement, plain and simple. It is a legally binding contract between the seller and the brokerage. And it defines the terms of that agreement, of that contract. It also defines the obligation of each party to the other in the agreement, and it is very specific. It is specific to one property for a defined period of time. So the first thing you have to discuss dealing with any contract are the parties to the contract. And for an exclusive right of sale listing agreement, there are two parties to the contract, the seller and the brokerage. The listing agent is not a party, but a representative of the brokerage as party to the agreement for his or her contractual agreement, meaning the independent contractor agreement that you signed at the beginning of the year with Sand Peak Realty gives you the authority to act as a representative on behalf of the brokerage when signing or dealing with any exclusive right of sale listing agreement. The agreement also spells out very clearly how each party is to perform, the compensation for that performance, the terms of the agreement, how to cancel the agreement, and how to resolve any conflict from the agreement. So what will you find in the listing agreement? Well, it lists the compensation to the brokerage for performance. That's one of the most important things we do to get paid. It also gives the brokerage responsibility and authority to market the property. It defines the price and the terms that will be acceptable to the seller. It describes the termination, dispute resolution, and additional terms that the seller and broker agree to add to the agreement. And lastly, it defines the nature of the agreement between the brokerage and the seller. How do we enforce and effect the contract? Well, the agreement becomes contractually binding when the seller receives a broker-signed agreement. The broker's responsibilities are in effect until one of three things happens. Either the property successfully closes at escrow, there's a mutually agreed upon termination, or the agreement expires at the termination date. If the property expires at the termination date and is relisted with another brokerage, then the brokerage has no further obligations or right to compensation. So let's spend a few minutes going over each section of the exclusive right of sale listing agreement so you have a thorough understanding of what they are. The first one is the authority to sell the property. Well, right off the bat, the seller gives the broker the exclusive right to sell the real and personal property described below. What does that mean? That means the broker is the only one who can actually sell the property for the seller. If it is conveyed in any manner, whether through deed transfer or contract, or if the seller brings the buyer, or if your uncle brings the buyer, or whoever brings the buyer, the broker will be paid and compensated for their efforts during the terms of this exclusive right of sale listing agreement. So it defines the time frame of the agreement. It states that our brokerage practices fair housing and does not discriminate. It also asks the seller that they certify that they can legally convey the property. That's very important. As well as it states very clearly that this agreement does not guarantee a sale. In Section 2, you'll find the description of the property. It defines the property and the legal description. Quick note, if it does not fit in the type space, use an attachment. It also defines the occupancy of the property, whether it's currently occupied by a tenant or not, and as well as it defines what will convey with the property, the personal property, including appliances. You want to make sure that you write the entire amount, everything staying in this section, including any fixtures, pool equipment, things of that nature. Section 3 is the price and terms. It sets the price and the financing terms that will be acceptable to the seller. It also allows the seller to offer seller financing and/or assumption of mortgage if the mortgagor will allow. Lastly, and one of the most important parts, and one of the parts that is missed most by most agents, is it defines any seller expenses for mortgage discount fees or closing cost concession that the seller will agree to pay on behalf of the buyer. Again, these are the closing costs that are associated with the contracts. Section 4 describes the broker obligations, and it's pretty short and sweet. It defines what the broker obligations are to the seller. And notice, there's only one, and it is only that this is a binding agreement that you will make diligent and continued efforts to sell the property until a sales contract is pending on the property. Nowhere on there does it say until it's closed. We'll have more later in this discussion. But again, the broker agrees to make diligent and continued efforts to sell the property until a sales contract is pending on the property. Section 5 discusses the multiple listing service. It lets the seller know the property will go into the MLS in a timely fashion. It also authorizes the broker to report to the MLS the details of the sale, and it advises the seller that all members of the MLS can use this information unless the seller directs otherwise. So what does this really mean for the seller? It means that their information when they sell the property is going to wind up on the MLS, on Trulia, Zillow, all of our websites. That's basically it in a nutshell. Section 6 is the broker authority. It defines the authorities or the duties that the seller gives the broker to act on their behalf. There are 8 of them listed here. Things dealing with advertising, signage, mortgage information, providing a CMA, the lockboxes, verbal offers, acting as a single agent, and virtual office websites. The listing agent needs to read these authorities to the seller at the listing agreement appointment and make sure that they understand them correctly and fully. Section 7 is the seller obligations. These define the obligations the seller has to the broker. These include to cooperate with the broker to carry out the agreement, to provide keys, to inform broker of any changes of status, to indemnify or hold harmless the broker, to comply with all FIRPTA rules and regulations, to make all disclosures known, and to consult professional advice when you have a question outside of the realm of the agent. The listing agent again needs to read these obligations to the seller at the listing appointment and make sure they completely understand them. Section 8, our favorite section, compensation, defines how the seller will compensate the brokerage for procuring a ready, willing, and able buyer to purchase the property based on the terms of this agreement or terms acceptable to a seller. It defines how much is due and the circumstances on which it is due. You need to understand this section completely. Again, this is compensation. Nowhere does it say commission. Again, compensation. In Section 9, this is how we cooperate with others. It defines that the brokerage will cooperate with other brokers and they will be compensated. It does allow for some leeway if it is not in the seller's best interest to work with a particular agent or brokerage. It defines the amount of that compensation that we will give the other broker, and also gives notice to the seller that the brokerage may represent the buyer. That's obviously what we want to do. We want to double end on it if we can. Section 10, that's the next section, the brokerage relationship. Very important. It defines the relationship between the brokerage and the seller. This is a Florida law and must be discussed. Again, this is a Florida law and you have to take the time to discuss this section with your seller. Section 6 of this agreement says that the brokerage will act as a single agent and may transition to a transaction broker. You need to explain what that is. You have a duty to make sure your seller is aware of the difference between a single agent and a transactional broker. Section 11, this is the conditional termination. This is the one that's always the hardest for all agents. It defines how the brokerage again the brokerage, may agree to terminate this agreement at the seller's request. The seller must reimburse the brokerage for all direct expenses, sign an agreement, and pay a cancellation fee. Also, the brokerage may void the conditional termination if the seller pays the fees stated in paragraph 8A. Also, if the seller transfers the property during the conditional termination time period up to the termination date, then the seller can pay a reduced amount and get out of the cancellation as well. It's very confusing. We'll explain it in more detail in just a few minutes. Section 12 discusses dispute resolution. This defines the methods that disputes between the parties to the agreement, the seller and the brokerage, will resolve their differences. It clearly defines that mediation will be attempted first. It also clearly states that if litigation occurs, the prevailing party will be able to recover attorney's fees and costs from the other party. It gives an opportunity for both parties to agree that if mediation does not work, then the dispute will go to arbitration and will be binding. And lastly, if it goes to arbitration, each party will equally split the cost to the arbitrator. Section 13 is the miscellaneous section. It defines other terms of the agreement. It defines that the agreement is binding upon the heirs, the representatives, administrators, successors, and assigns of both parties. It also states that the broker may assign this agreement. And it also states that there's no prior or present agreements will be binding on either party unless included in this agreement. It lets the seller know that electronic signatures are acceptable, as will be faxes. It also defines the term buyer. The last section is additional terms. This is a blank section where the brokerage or the seller may use to add additional terms or agreements to the contracts. The terms must be approved by the broker before the agreement is signed by the broker. If the broker does not agree to these terms, then the agreement is not executed. You need to be very specific if you use this section. Do not use this space unless instructed by the broker and or the seller. Again, the broker must agree to the terms. The last section is the signature and delivery section. Sellers must sign and date this agreement. An electronic signature is acceptable. As authorized sales associate, only the broker or record or the assignee may sign and authorize this agreement. You do not sign in this section. The listing agent must deliver a copy of the signed agreement within 24 hours of broker execution and must notate on the agreement when this has occurred. This is very important. Contract law is about execution. Now that we've discussed the sections, let's spend some time on important things to remember and go over for the contract. First is time periods. This agreement gives the brokerage the authority to sell the property from the date of broker execution to the termination date listed in Section 1. Once under contract, the agreement will automatically extend through the date of actual closing. It states that in there. My recommendation, however, is get the seller to sign a modification of terms before that happens. So that way, if it cancels, you may continue to market the property. For 180 days after the termination date, whether through expiration or conditional termination, the brokerage is due the commission or the compensation, as we say, if the seller transfers or contracts to transfer the property. Caveat: if the property is relisted after the termination date with another broker, this does not apply. This agreement is still in effect regarding the transfer of the property, even if the property is conditionally terminated. This agreement is fully in effect until one of two things actually happens. It either hits the termination date, or there's a conditional termination, a void of that conditional termination, whether through relisting with another broker or the seller pays the fees. Next, we want to talk about the description. Make sure when you enter the agreement that it matches exactly what is on the tax records. Very important to do that. Also, if you can't fit the entire legal description on this page in these sections, type See Attached Addenda number, whatever, and check the See Attached box. List all the personal property that is staying on the property. Discuss that with the seller now. Appliances, which ones? Pool equipment, fans, lights, garage door openers, hot tubs, swing sets, storage sheds, outbuildings, tool sheds, play sets, etc. If in doubt, always ask. Do not ever assume. A big one that gets people in trouble is pool equipment. The next one that gets people in trouble is refrigerators and freezers in the garage. So make sure you ask, don't assume. If the property is occupied by a tenant, make sure you get a copy of the lease agreement and its terms so you can make sure that you can legally transfer that property while the tenant is in the property under the lease. Also, if it's in a trust or a corporation, ask for a copy of the Articles of Incorporation and the operating agreement that designates who can sign and make the decisions and actually has the authority to sell the property. The last thing to remember on the description is if the property is in probate, please have your seller put you in contact with their attorneys to make sure it can be sold and transferred. Now we're going to start discussions about price and terms. This agreement is about having the seller understand what terms and price they will find acceptable to be able to transfer the property. So you're going to discuss with the client that these are the terms for an acceptable offer. So if you bring them an offer that matches or exceeds these terms, then you have fulfilled your obligation. Make sure you discuss the expectations for each type of financing. Advise them that if they list, for example, FHA and VA as acceptable financing terms to them, then the buyer has a reasonable expectation that the property will meet the minimum requirements for FHA and VA financing, and that if the property is deficient and needs repairs, the buyer will expect the seller to make those repairs. Very important. Also discuss with the sellers the expectations of closing costs. Get them to commit to a percentage that they will consider acceptable with a reasonable offer. For example, if you get a full price offer that matches the terms and the buyer is asking for 3% towards closing costs, will you consider that a good offer? Yes or no? Maybe it's 2%, maybe it's 1%, maybe it's none. You need to make sure that this is done up front so that way when it's time to negotiate, the sellers are already prepared for that number. You also need to talk at length with the seller about what it takes for a home to qualify for FHA and VA financing and ensure that the house actually meets those criteria. Speak about the percentage of properties that are closing in their area with those types of financings. You need to come to the table. 20% close with cash, 35% are conventional, another 25% are FHA, and 15% are VA. Advise the buyer that if an FHA or VA buyer comes to the table and presents an offer and it is accepted, that once the inspection and appraisal are done, if there are any needed repairs, the seller will need to make them as the buyer has an expectation that the house will already qualify. Another very important part is speak with the seller about appraisals. Explain how long an appraisal is good for, how to petition the findings, and that if required, it is required on all financing loans. Advise them when they accept an offer, they may need to reduce the price to match the appraisal value. That is up to them. They will be the ones doing that reduction. It can't come from anywhere else. Either they reduce the price to the appraised value or the deal is done and you move on. Now we're at your job, the broker obligations. There's only one, and that is to make diligent and continued efforts to sell the property until a sales contract is pending. This is very important for you to understand. Once the property goes pending, you have fulfilled your duties and you are due your commission. The brokerage is due its compensation. You are due your commission. Stop giving it away. You've already earned it. When you give away closing cost percentage and when you help to reduce for appraisals or repairs, guess what? That's not your job. That's the seller's job. You have earned your compensation. Stop giving money away. Use this section to share with the seller all of the things that you will be doing to market their home. This is your value time. This is when you put the listing agreement aside and you show them and you tell them what you're going to do. Again, prove to them that you are worth the commission that you are about to ask for. You haven't even asked for the compensation yet. Don't just tell them what you're going to do. Show them. Leave them something that shows what you do. Your goal is to have the seller believe there's more value in using you than there is in using anyone else. So be prepared. Put some pictures and videos on your tablet or your phone so you can show them. Bring in some of your flyers. Bring in your checklist of how you do open houses. Bring in the materials that you're going to do for leave behinds. Make sure that they understand the system that you use to reach out to other agents that the house is on the market. Show them what you do on social media. Make sure you prove the value to them. Spend a lot of time here. Slow down. Use your visuals. It's a great time to use that tablet and show the videos and the pictures. Bring out your marketing book. Show them what they can expect from you. And then once you do that, you have to go deliver. Next, let's talk about broker authority. These are the things that the seller is authorizing you or giving you authority to do for them on their behalf. Spend time explaining each of these to the seller. Again, there's 8 of them. Be prepared with examples and a full explanation of what each means. It's very important that you explain how the lockbox system works. I suggest that you bring one so you can show the way it works. You might want to also bring a showing report as well as showing requests so they can see how the system works. In Section 6, it states that the brokerage will provide an objective, comparable market analysis. So guess what? Bring one. That's right. Bring one. And not only bring one, but make it look nice. This is one of the things that they're going to be leaving behind with the seller. You want to make sure that it shows you in the best light. I suggest that you bind it or put it in a report folder. Also in this section, you want to talk about verbal offers as well. I suggest no verbal offers. This is why. I like to put it in writing. I like to do that for negotiations as well, because this sets up for the seller for this phone call. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I have an offer for you that just came in. Great! First question, how much? Well, I'll discuss that when I come see you. Since we only accept written offers, I have to present it to you in writing. I'll be right over. I think you're going to be excited about it because I am. Then we get to talk to the sellers about their obligations. These are the things that we expect them to do. This is where you set the precedents and you let them know exactly what to expect. Spend some time on showing the home. How do you show the home? What to expect when you show the home? How do we get the home ready for a showing, especially at a moment's notice? Also talk with them briefly about how you gather feedback and that information so that way you can share it with them so we get valuable insight onto what a buyer is looking at. Also, we need a key. It's a must. We have to make sure that we can also access all areas of the property for a showing. If there's a detached garage, a storage shed, a hidden pantry, make sure you can access all parts of the property, because if you can't, the buyer's going to think and wonder, why can't we get in that section? I can't put an offer in until I put that section and see what's going on behind that locked door. Inform the seller that per this agreement, they have a duty to advise you if they lease the property, mortgage the property, or encumber the property in any way. They also have a duty to completely and honestly fill out all legally required disclosures. I bring a complete set at this point. I explain them to them all, and I take my time. Do it right the first time so you're not having to scramble when an offer comes in. More on this topic in a bit. Also explain Section 7D fully as well. It goes hand in hand with the disclosures. They have to make sure that they are correct, and they have to make sure that they're honest. Lastly, advise the seller if they have questions outside of this agreement or want further explanation, they need to seek professional advice, whether it's an attorney, a tax accountant, whatever it may be. Now comes our favorite part, compensation. Hopefully, at this point, you have shown the sellers your value, so that the percentage of compensation that you're asking once you've completed your obligations will be okay. It is not a commission. Get that through your head. Do not tell the seller the commission I earn once you close. It is not a commission. It is compensation. The seller compensates the brokerage as specified in this agreement, and the brokerage then pays the buying agent and the selling agent a commission per their agreements of cooperation. The agreement states very clearly as well that for procuring a buyer who is ready, willing, and able to purchase the property on the terms of this agreement or on any other terms acceptable to the seller. This means that once an offer is accepted and the contract goes pending, compensation is due. It also means that if the brokerage presents an offer to the seller that meets or exceeds the terms of this agreement, compensation is due. Hence why I tell you to get in writing up in the top sections how much of a percentage of closing costs that they are willing to pay. Section 8A also makes a very important statement that the compensation is due no later than the closing date. However, closing is not a prerequisite for broker's fee being earned. Again, closing is not a prerequisite for the broker's fee being earned. Also in this section, you need to speak with the sellers and discuss that our brokerage charges a $250 transaction and technology fee per our addendum to contract, which you should have already discussed. This is a standard practice of the industry and is used for the purposes described on the addendum. We are a lot lower than many other brokerages. So again, make sure you discuss that $250 transaction and technology fee. And effective December 1st, that fee is fully due and payable to Sandpeak Realty on every transaction you close. So if you're not comfortable with the $250 fee and you don't want to charge your buyer or your seller, that's okay. But just know that it will come out of your compensation to Sandpeak Realty. Also, when you're discussing compensation, it discusses how we cooperate and compensate other brokers. It is important that your seller understands this process. The seller compensates the brokerage for its services when it brings a ready, willing, and able buyer. When a different brokerage brings the buyer, our brokerage, Sandpeak Realty, will share that compensation amount with the brokerage as described in Section 9. This is not an additional amount. So if the amount of compensation on the agreement is 6% and we're cooperating by paying the other brokerage 3%, it's not 6 plus 3 or 9% of the purchase price that the seller is paying. It's only 6%. Also note that they understand that we cooperate with all other brokers, okay? And if there's an agent or agency that the seller directs you not to accept offers from, then you need to add that to Section 14 of this agreement. That's where that section plays into play. If you're dealing with a lease or a lease option purchase, compensation is tied to the lease. If you have any questions about that or need further explanation, let me know. Very important, our fees are due per this section in one of these situations. When any of these occur, our compensation is due. When the property is transferred, whether by sale, lease, exchange, bankruptcy, or any other means of transfer, regardless of whether the buyer is secured by the broker, the seller, or anyone else. If it transfers, we get compensated. If the seller refuses or fails to sign an offer at the price and terms of this agreement, defaults on the contract, or agrees with the buyer to cancel an executed sales contract, we are due our compensation. If within 180 days after the termination date, the seller transfers or contracts to transfer the property to any prospect with whom the broker, the seller, or any real estate licensee communicated about prior to the termination date, we are due our compensation. Now, if it is terminated and the property is relisted with a new brokerage, then this is not applicable. It is vital that these three are fully disclosed and discussed. Let me make sure you understand one more important point. We'll talk about the cancellation in just a few minutes. This agreement is conditionally set that the agreement is in place until the end of the termination date. Make sure you understand that. Now let's talk about retained deposits. This is a hot topic. Make the seller aware that in the event that the buyer defaults on the contract, as consideration for broker services, the brokerage is entitled to receive 50% of all deposits that the seller retains. This amount cannot exceed the fee amount of paragraph 8A, or the total compensation that is due. Take the opportunity to explain that one of the points that you will help the seller to negotiate on is a large deposit. Let me throw this point in. We do not negotiate contracts. We help our buyers and sellers with their negotiations. There is a difference. Make sure you understand that. If the buyer exercises their option to cancel the contract per any agreed upon term or contingency, such as inspection, financing, appraisal, house to sell, etc., then this does not apply. This only applies if the seller retains any part of the deposit. I always let the sellers know that they will retain the deposit and compensate us as part of our services. If you say it that way, it's a little softer and a little easier for them to understand. Make sure you take the time to explain this to them, though, because there's some confusion about what happens and how does a buyer cancel, how does the seller cancel, what are all these different possibilities, and what are all the terms that a buyer and or seller can cancel the contract under. So let's talk about termination. And this is a hard topic to discuss. Do not shy away from it. You are performing a professionally licensed service. Just as any professional service, you deserve payment for the work that you provide. Put that in your head. The seller can request in writing at any time to conditionally terminate this agreement. The seller must sign a withdrawal agreement, which you will provide. They must reimburse the brokerage for direct expenses incurred, and they must pay a cancellation fee of $2,000 or 2% of the list price, whatever is greater. That is our company policy. $2,000 or 2% of the list price, whatever is greater. That is our cancellation fee. You will actually write that number on your listing agreement. Actually, I prefer that it was typed in and not written in. Okay. Let's take a moment to talk about the reimbursing of the brokerage for direct expenses incurred. One of the things you need to have when you do a listing presentation is a sheet that explains very clearly the things that you provide for the seller and associated costs with them. For example, professional photography, flyers, the post installation, the signage, maybe your website, maybe that you put it in a professional publication, maybe that you pay for a Google ad, whatever it may be. You need to have a sheet that explains those costs directly. Your MLS costs. If you do 12 transactions a year and your MLS costs are $1,000, then you need to make sure that you divide $1,000 by 12 and your MLS participation fees are listed on that sheet as well. Why? Because if they cancel, 3 things have to take place. They sign a withdrawal agreement, they reimburse the brokerage for direct expenses incurred, and they pay a cancellation fee. That's a lot of money. Again, you are performing a professional service. You deserve payment. One more thing, this is important to understand. If the property transfers ownership or the seller goes under contract during the time from the date of the conditional termination to the termination date listed in section 1 of the contract, and up to the protection period, which is 180 days after the cancellation and the termination date, then the broker may agree to void this conditional termination if the seller pays the fee stated in 8A less the cancellation fee. So that could be 6% minus $2,000. Does that make sense? Basically, what it's saying is, I will cancel this agreement. However, the agreement is in effect until the termination date. It's conditionally terminated. If you go relist with another broker in that termination date period, I'm still due my commission if you sell that property within that time period. If you want me to release you from that time period, then you have to pay the cancellation fee, and if it closes in that period, then I'm due the remaining balance, which is that 6% or 5% minus the cancellation fee. It's a little confusing, but take the time to explain it and make your buyer understand exactly what's going on, or I'm sorry, your seller understand exactly what is going on. We're almost at the home stretch. This is a binding agreement. Make sure that your seller understands that. It's binding on both the parties and their heirs, the representatives, administrators, successors, and assigns. So what does this really mean? For the seller, it means that anyone who takes ownership of the property, whether through estate, will, or as a representative, or in the case of a business, if the business is sold, transferred, or its legal representatives take over, this agreement is binding on the seller until the termination date and the protection period is still in effect. For the broker, this usually falls into place when either A, the brokerage is sold or becomes a new company, or B, when the listing agent leaves the brokerage and the broker allows the agent to take the listing to the new brokerage. Last section, a few miscellaneous items. Show the seller a modification to list agreement form and why it is used. Discuss with the sellers that electronic signatures are valid. Discuss with the sellers what to expect when an offer comes in. How to negotiate on their behalf, remember, how to counter an offer, and the process that goes on after acceptance. Discuss with the sellers their expected closing costs. Discuss with the sellers how to get their home ready to market and show. Discuss with the sellers what the next steps are and what you will be doing to market the home for them. Discuss with them how, when, and what will be communicated throughout the process. And finally, at the end, when you've signed all the paperwork, make sure you double check for signatures and initials, and make sure you have all the necessary disclosures filled out completely. This is a lot of information. I would suggest to most of you that you go back, take a lot of notes, and re-listen again. You need to make sure that you understand this document inside and out, especially when it comes to compensation, when it comes to cancellation, and when it comes to performance. These are very vital things. If you can explain this fully and take your time and make sure you prove the value to the seller, I guarantee you that 99% of the time, if you do this, you will get the listing. So good luck. Join us in our next video where we'll be going over all of the disclosures and addendas for a seller to sign at the listing agreement. I hope you found it to be useful and have a great day.